What do you call it when a man dies in a powder explosion? The workers at the DuPont mills on the Brandywine Creek in northern Delaware had a phrase for it. I found it in a book called Across the Creek, written by a Hagley Museum tour guide named Richard Templeton, who spent years going through company records and newspaper accounts and parish burial ledgers, tracking every one of the 235 people who died making gunpowder at the DuPont powder works on the Brandywine over the course of 120 years. The phrase was the title of his book. When a man was killed in a detonation at the DuPont mills, when the rolling mill blew or the press house went or the glazing drum ignited and the man inside it ceased to exist in any recognizable form, the other workers did not say he died. They did not say he was killed. They said he went across the creek, as if death were a direction, as if the man had simply crossed the water to the other side, the way a person might cross on a Sunday afternoon to visit a neighbor, except he crossed in pieces, because that is what a powder explosion does to the human body. There is no burn at those pressures. There is no injury in any conventional sense. The body is disassembled by the force of the blast and scattered across the landscape. The phrase existed because it had to exist. When your workplace kills an average of 2 men per year for 120 consecutive years, when you walk into the same building every morning knowing that the man who held your job before you went across, you do not speak of death the way other people speak of it. You develop a shorthand. You develop a euphemism. You develop a way to say the unsayable so that you can finish your shift and go home and eat supper with your wife and come back the next morning to the same mill where the last man went across. Between 1802, when the DuPont Company was founded on the banks of the Brandywine near Wilmington, Delaware, and 1921, when the powder mills finally closed, there were 288 explosions. 228 people were killed. 60 of those 288 explosions resulted in fatalities. The other 228 explosions destroyed buildings, hurled debris across the valley, shattered windows as far away as Wilmington, 4 miles to the south, and left the surviving workers to clean up and rebuild and go back to work on the same spot. The worst of the 288 happened on March 19, 1818. The DuPont family records call it the Great Explosion. 34 people were dead, 33 men and 1 woman. The woman was the wife of one of the 33. She was not in the mill when it blew. She was at home or near home, somewhere in the small cluster of workers' houses on the hillside above the powder yards. She heard the blast, she felt the concussion, and she ran down the hill toward the mill gate to find out if her husband was alive or dead. She did not reach the gate. The blast or the debris or the concussive force of the explosion killed her on her way down. Her husband was already dead inside the mill. Neither of them knew that the other had been killed. They left behind 3 children who were orphans before noon. That detail is preserved in the company records at the Hagley Museum and Library, the archive built on the grounds of the powder works themselves, a husband and wife, both dead in the same explosion, one inside the mill building and one running toward it. 3 children left to the care of the powder community. The records note the facts and move on to the next explosion, the way a ledger moves to the next line. I need to explain what a powder mill is and what the men inside it were doing every day they walked through that gate, because the machine at the center of this story is only dangerous in the context of the material it was pressing, and the material was the most volatile substance manufactured in the United States in the first half of the 19th century. Black powder is a mixture of 3 ingredients: potassium nitrate, called saltpeter, imported from India or refined from natural cave deposits; charcoal, produced by burning black willow branches gathered from the banks of the Brandywine; and sulfur, shipped in from Sicily or from deposits along the Gulf Coast. The proportions were approximately 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur by weight. Mixed correctly and ignited, the compound burns at approximately 400 meters per second. In the open air, it flashes. In a confined space, in a sealed press, in a closed building, or in a hogshead barrel, the speed of that burn and the volume of hot gas it produces create pressures that function identically to a high explosive detonation. The walls come apart. Everything inside the walls comes apart with them. Eleuthère Irénée DuPont, the company's founder, was a French immigrant who had studied chemistry under Antoine Lavoisier, the man widely regarded as the father of modern chemistry. Before the French Revolution sent Lavoisier to the guillotine in 1794, DuPont arrived in America in 1800 with his father Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours, a diplomat and economist, and the rest of the family fleeing the instability of revolutionary France. In 1801, he purchased a tract of land from a man named Jacob Broom on the Brandywine Creek near Wilmington for $6,700. He chose the location for three specific reasons. The Brandywine's drop over the geological feature called the Fall Line provided enough water power to drive dozens of mills simultaneously along a single mill race. The surrounding forests of black willow provided the raw material for the high-quality charcoal that made DuPont powder superior to the domestic competition, and the creek's proximity to the Delaware River provided a shipping route for the saltpeter and sulfur that had to be imported from abroad. Construction of the mills began in the summer of 1802. The first powder was produced in 1803. DuPont informed his family friend, President Thomas Jefferson, of the new enterprise, and Army contracts for refining saltpeter followed almost immediately, succeeded by substantial orders for finished gunpowder. By the end of 1804, the company had sold 39,000 pounds of powder. The following year, sales tripled. By the War of 1812, the DuPont Company was the largest gunpowder manufacturer in the United States, supplying the federal government and John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company as steady customers. The powder that helped build America, that blasted the railroad tunnels through the Appalachians, that quarried the stone for the cities, that armed the armies, that cleared the land, was made on this creek by these men in these buildings. The manufacturing process was divided across multiple structures, each handling a different stage of production, each one a potential bomb. The composition mill mixed the three raw ingredients together, wet, using water from the Brandywine to dampen the mixture and reduce the risk of ignition during grinding. Edge runners, heavy vertical stone wheels weighing several tons each, rolled in circles over the wet mixture in circular stone beds, grinding the ingredients together until the composition was uniformly blended. The edge runners were powered by water wheels or turbines connected to the mill race, and they ran continuously during production hours, with men feeding the wet mixture beneath the stones and scraping the ground composition out from the edges with wooden tools. Metal tools were forbidden. A steel scraper striking a stone bed containing black powder composition produces a spark. A spark produces a detonation. The men used wood and copper and leather. They wore no shoes with iron nails. They entered the mills in stocking feet or in special shoes with wooden soles. From the composition mill, the wet powder moved to the press house. This is the machine at the center of this story. The hydraulic press was powered by the same water system that drove the edge runners. It operated by applying enormous mechanical force to the damp powder, compressing it into dense cakes roughly 2 inches thick and a foot or more across. The cakes were then moved to the corning mill, where they were broken apart by toothed rollers and sifted through screens to produce granules of specific sizes for different applications. Fine grain for muskets, coarser grain for cannons, coarsest for blasting. From the corning mill, the granulated powder moved to the glazing mill, where it was tumbled in wooden drums with graphite to give each grain a smooth, moisture-resistant coating. From the glazing mill, the powder went to the drying house, where it sat in trays in a low-heat environment until the remaining moisture was driven off, and from the drying house to the packing house, where it was weighed, loaded into barrels and kegs and cans, and shipped. Every building in that chain contained black powder at some stage of its production. Every building had machinery in motion, surfaces in contact with the compound, opportunities for friction, heat, impact, or static discharge to provide the ignition energy that the powder was waiting for. The question was never whether a building would explode. The question was when and who would be inside when it did. The answer to that second question was, unfailingly, the same kind of man. Irish immigrants. They arrived on the Brandywine starting in the 1820s and kept arriving for the rest of the century. They came through chain migration, the way immigrant communities have always built themselves in America. One man found work in the powder. He wrote home. His brother came. His cousin came. His cousin married a powderman's daughter. Their son went to work in the same mill his father had worked in and his grandfather before him. The community was small, isolated by geography and by the nature of the work, because nobody who did not make powder wanted to live within blast radius of the mills. The families intermarried. The names recurred across generations. The company's petite ledgers, which recorded wages and employment from 1802 onward, are filled with the same surnames repeated decade after decade. Doherty, Gallagher, Toy, Gibbons, Flanagan. The same families in the same mills, dying in the same explosions, generation after generation. A man's first jobs in the powder community were outdoor work, farming the company's land, gathering willow branches for charcoal, hauling stone for the masons who built and rebuilt the mill walls. Once he proved himself sober and reliable, the company put him to work in the powder. He was then subject, as Templeton wrote, to the ever-present caprice of the mix that might send him across the creek, a daily risk. There is a woman named Mary Toy in the company records. Her father was a powder man. He was killed in an explosion. Some years later, Mary married another powder man. He was killed in another explosion. Mary Toy lost her father to the Brandywine, and then she lost her husband to it. The records do not say what she did after. They do not say how she raised her children, or whether she remarried, or whether she stayed in the community or left. The records note the deaths and move to the next page. Mary Toy is a single line in a ledger, repeated twice, once for each man the creek took from her. The DuPont family lived on the property. Eleutherian Mills, their home, sat on a bluff directly above the powder yards, overlooking the mills, the race, the creek, and the thin fourth walls that were designed to blow out toward the water when the next explosion came. The founder's father, Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours, had died on August 7, 1817, after helping fight a fire in the factory below the house. He was the first DuPont family member to die from a powder yard accident. 7 months and 12 days after his death, the Great Explosion of March 19, 1818, killed 34 people in the yards below the house where he had lived. Alexis Irénée DuPont, one of the founder's sons, who worked the powder yards himself, and who understood the daily calculus of the work as well as any of the men he employed, was once overheard telling a visiting preacher that anyone in this business should be ready to meet his maker at any time. That is not bravado. That is arithmetic. 2 deaths per year, for over a century. If your family worked in the mills, the mines, the furnaces, the powder yards, if your grandfather's headstone says something you never understood until now, I want to hear about it. Leave a comment. Subscribe if you want to see what I find next. The Great Explosion of 1818 originated in the upper yard. The company records compiled by Francis Gurney DuPont, a family member who documented the history of the explosions in the 19th century, described the event in spare, factual language. A large building containing hogsheads of powder, stored since the contracts of 1812 for the fabrication of A.F. and Company, was exploded. The glazing mill, packing house, and magazine destroyed. 33 men and 1 woman killed by this disaster. The shockwave reached Wilmington, 4 miles to the south, with enough force that residents fled their houses into the streets, believing an earthquake was underway. A newspaper correspondent wrote his dispatch in the middle of the street because he would not go back inside. DuPont's house gone, many killed, his wife and daughter safe, Duplanty's cotton mill injured, McLean's mill safe, except the sentence is incomplete. The correspondent did not finish it. He was standing outdoors 4 miles from the blast, waiting to see if the main powder magazine would go next. At noon, the magazine was reported safe. The immediate danger was considered over. The cause was almost certainly the press. The hydraulic powder press, operated by applying enormous mechanical force to a material that ignites from friction. The press plates, the metal surfaces that contacted the powder cake during compression, had to be clean. Perfectly clean. Any contamination on those surfaces, any grit, any fragment of dried powder residue from a previous pressing, any foreign particle that created a point of friction between the plate and the cake under thousands of pounds of hydraulic pressure could generate enough localized heat to ignite the powder. The press did not malfunction. It operated exactly as designed. The compression itself was the ignition source. The machine did its job, and the physics of friction against a contaminated surface turned the powder into a bomb. The press house was rebuilt, not relocated. Rebuilt. In the same location, on the same foundation stones, connected to the same water power delivery system that fed from the mill race running behind the line of mill buildings. I spent a long time with the rebuild decision because it reveals something fundamental about the economics of industrial death in the 19th century, and it is a calculation that has appeared in every story on this channel, from the Bessemer rail that was never tested to the ventilation furnace that was turned off to save fuel to the wooden passenger cars that nobody replaced with steel because the cost was too high. The DuPont powder works ran on water power from the Brandywine Creek. Every mill building was positioned at a specific point along the mill race, a man-made channel that diverted water from the creek and directed it sequentially past each building. Water wheels and later water turbines positioned between every pair of mills converted the kinetic energy of the flowing water into the mechanical energy that drove the edge runners, the presses, the corning mills, and the glazing drums. The position of each building along the race was dictated by the hydrology of the creek, the gradient of the fall, and the volume of water available at each stage. Moving a building meant moving its water intake. Moving the water intake meant redigging the race. Redigging the race meant disrupting the water supply to every mill downstream. The cost of relocating the press house to a new position on the race was, according to the internal DuPont correspondence preserved in the Hagley archive, 3 times the cost of rebuilding the press house where it already stood. 3 times the cost. The math was clear. Relocate the press and spend $3 for every $1 it would cost to rebuild in place. Or rebuild in place and accept that the next press operator would walk through the same door, stand on the same floor where 33 men had been killed, and operate the same machine under the same physics. DuPont chose the math. They rebuilt in 6 months. The press went back where it was. The water kept flowing. The powder kept pressing. And the next man who went to work in that building understood the calculation as clearly as the company did, because the stone walls on 3 sides of him were the evidence. Those walls were designed to survive the blast. He was not. The 3-wall construction is the most distinctive feature of the Brandywine powder mills, and it is visible today at the Hagley Museum in the ruins that line both sides of the creek. Each mill building was constructed with 3 thick walls of gneiss, a local stone quarried from the Brandywine Valley, dense enough to absorb the force of a blast. The 4th wall, the one facing the creek, was built of light materials, wood or thin masonry, designed to blow out rather than resist. When a mill exploded, the 3 stone walls contained and redirected the blast outward through the weak 4th wall toward the water. Debris and fragments of the building, even fragments of the man inside, were carried across to the far bank. That is where the phrase came from. Across the creek was not a metaphor. It was not a poetic abstraction. It was a description of trajectory. The mills were designed so the blast went in one direction, and that direction was across the water. And the men who died in those blasts went with the debris because the physics of the explosion and the geometry of the building sent them that way. The language and the architecture arose from the same source, the certainty that the powder would blow, and the only question was how to manage the direction. The explosions did not stop after 1818. They could not stop. The nature of the work made them inevitable. The rolling mill could detonate if a stone chip from the edge runner struck the bed at the wrong angle. The corning mill could detonate if a dried fragment of powder jammed between the teeth of the rollers. The glazing mill could detonate if the graphite coating failed to insulate the grains from friction against the drum wall. The drying house could detonate from ambient heat. The packing house could detonate from static discharge. There was no stage in the process that was safe. There was no building that could not go. And over 120 years, nearly all of them did, most of them more than once. The 1890 explosion in the upper yard detonated close to 50,000 pounds of powder and was felt in Philadelphia, 30 miles to the northeast. It killed 12 people, including 1 woman and 1 child, and it damaged dozens of workers' homes on the hillside above the yards. The 1915 packing house explosion killed 30 people, many of them among the youngest employees in the works. It was the second deadliest explosion after 1818. William Buchanan, a young electrician who was installing a buzzer system in the shop's office when the blast occurred, described rushing to cut the electrical power to the yard immediately after the explosion and then watching the dead being gathered. He recalled decades later that there was a bad explosion in 1915 when 32 people were killed. That is the big explosion he remembered. The ruins of the powder mills are still standing along the Brandywine today. They are part of the Hagley Museum and Library, situated on 235 acres of wooded rolling hills, where the stone walls of the mills line both sides of the creek, and the mill race still carries water past the foundations of buildings that have not produced powder since 1921. The three-wall construction is visible everywhere you walk. The thick stone walls stand, covered in moss and lichen, holding the shape of the buildings they once formed. The fourth walls, the ones that face the creek, the ones that blew out over and over and were rebuilt over and over and blew out again, are gone, open to the sky. Trees grow where the edge runners used to grind and the men used to stand. The museum fires a small black powder charge for visitors during demonstrations, using a brass instrument called an eprouvette that measures the force of the blast. The wheel spins, the crowd watches. It is educational, it is safe. It is a reminder packaged for families on a Sunday afternoon of the substance that sent 228 people across the creek over the course of 120 years on the same ground where the families are standing. I started with a phrase. He went across the creek, a shorthand for death invented by men who needed a way to say the unsayable because the unsayable happened every year, sometimes twice, sometimes more. For over a century in the same mills, on the same water, on the same creek. On March 19, 1818, 33 men went across the creek in a single morning. A 34th, a woman whose name the company records do not preserve, died running toward the gate to find out whether her husband was among them. He was. Neither parent knew the other had been killed. They left 3 children who would grow up in a community where the mills kept running and the press kept pressing and the creek kept carrying whatever the blast sent across it, which was sometimes debris and sometimes stone and sometimes the men who had gone to work that morning and would not be coming home. The cost of relocating the press house was 3 times the cost of rebuilding it in the same location. So they rebuilt. The mill went back where it was. The powder went back under the press. The men went back inside the building, and the creek kept running past the stone walls that were built to outlast the men who worked between them, the way it runs today past the ruins where the families walk on Sundays and the wheel of the eprouvette spins in the afternoon light. America wasn't built in boardrooms. It was built in the dark, inside furnaces under 40-ton weights. And sometimes inside a press house on the Brandywine, where the machine that compressed the powder was also the machine that ignited it, and the men who worked it had a phrase for what happened